President of the New Hampshire Association, private practice, medical education, senior medical education advisor for Emerson Ecologics, and just all around wonderful person.
Thank you, Lynn. All right, well, welcome. You've made it to the last lecture of the day. Woo! All right, so it's like drinking from a fire hose, right? So we're going to talk about water. All right, so I like to start off by giving a macro view of a topic, especially if it's something that we haven't seen a ton of times. This is data from 2004 to 2009, and it shows you the rates of chemicals that are regulated and unregulated. So of the 316 chemicals that were monitored from 2004 to 2009 by the EPA, 316 was the total chemicals they looked at. 136 were found above health guidelines, affecting 252 million Americans. So of the unregulated chemicals, 202, 49 of those chemicals affecting nearly 54 million Americans were above health guidelines. This is a long stretch of time, a long time to have our municipal water supply out of regulation. So a macro view. All right, when you think about water, this is what I want you to be thinking about. It's great to have visuals. So radionucleotides, disinfectant byproducts, microbes, the bugs, VOCs, arsenic, and all the other metals, disinfectant byproducts, disinfectants, as well as I want you to be thinking, we have about an hour. So I also want you to include in that list in your mind drug residues, herbicides, pesticides, and also think of the region of the country that they're from. If it's an agricultural area, if there's an industrial area, of those things, if there's fracking, other things that might be influencing the water supply in that area. All right, to give a little background, the EPA regulations established in 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act, requiring the EPA to have guidelines on contaminants for our drinking water. And the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations are legally enforceable primary standards and also treatment techniques, the way we kill the bugs in the water for our public water supply. These are terms that we're going to be using throughout the presentation when we hone in on individual contaminants, so it's a good idea to understand what they mean. The maximum contaminant level goal, and so that's the goal where there's no known or expected health risk. These are definitions by the EPA. I would say, and I think Dr. Fine as well, as many researchers and scientists across the globe would say, those aren't really the maximum contaminant level goals. There's room for interpretation on whether or not we agree with those goals, and we'll go into that by each contaminant. The maximum contaminant levels are what we're going to be talking about a lot, and those are the maximum contaminant levels. Important to know that those are the enforceable guidelines, and then the other two are just based on the disinfectants. All right, so if you remember from that first chart, it was about a little over 300 that they looked at total chemicals. The EPA only has guidelines on about 100 chemicals in our drinking water. Imagine of the thousands that there's about 100. And the EPA has not adopted a single new standard for regulating chemicals in drinking water since 1996.
Microphone.
Oh, nobody could hear me?
Yeah.
Do I want me to do it again?
No.
Just kidding. Okay. All right. All right, this is the Natural Resource Defense Council. Has everybody heard of these folks? So the Natural Resource Defense Council is an international group of activists on air and water and environmental issues across the globe. So scientists, it's a nonprofit, and what they did is they looked at the EPA data for again? Higher?
I think it's off.
Oh, that's not fair.
Yeah, I think this. Testing, testing. Technical difficulties.
Can everybody still hear me if I project a bit while we're sorting this out? Or is it for the video? I should wait.
No, you're good. Hello?
Oh, watch out. Now I'm in trouble. Okay, so this is, the NRDC did a review of the EPA data for 2015. And what they found were 80,000 reported violations. This is for 1 year. 80,000 reported violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and these included health-based violations. All 50 states had violations. This means that roughly 1 out of 3 communities in the United States had reported violations, affecting nearly 1/4 of the U.S. population. So nearly 25% of the population in the United States was drinking water that had violations. And due to the widespread underreporting, according to the NRDC, the actual number of violations and systems breaking the law is likely much higher because they're self-patrolling, right? They're self-monitoring, self-policing. All right, so of those 80,000 violations, and these are for total violations, the EPA and states took formal action against only 13% of them. So nearly 9 out of 10 violations, there was no action on it. There was no filing of a civil or criminal complaint. And of those violations, of the reported violations, only 3.3% received penalties. It's completely unacceptable in our water supply. And then I just want to point out a little bit about the regulations for EPAs, because I think for a lot of people in this room, it might be an opportunity. So the EPA is ultimately responsible for setting and enforcing the rules about the public water system. However, it allows states and Native American tribes to apply for primacy enforcement responsibility, or primacy, which grants them substantial federal funding and imposes legal obligations. So the states can take this on themselves if they want to. So this allows, it's an easier way to have to influence what's happening in your local water supply. So that's great. It's much harder to create change at the federal level. All right. So this one I think hits home even more so, because these are based on health-based violations. So these violations, we know, have an impact on human health. We know that they're reporting these violations actually have a negative impact on the people drinking the water. So over 12,000 violations. Of those health-based violations, only 21% of agencies took formal action. And of those, only less than 7% received penalties for health-based violations of our drinking water. I'm not smiling because that's good news, but I had a friend over there taking a picture, so I go, "Arr." Okay. It looks better. Yeah, that angers me. So, all right, so let's see. We want to see who's doing what. So based on 2015, who's winning in reverse? So Texas had the most health-based violations in the country. It doesn't mean that they had the worst water in the country, but they had the most reported violations. And don't forget there's significant underreporting, because this is a lot of self-policing, right? They're reporting on themselves. So you can see Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Georgia. And this is a map that shows the darkest color represents the increased population served by that municipal water supply that had health-based violations.
California's not looking good.
Not looking good. I'm not feeling good about New England either. Okay. All right, so based on the NRDC data of those 80,000 violations that were reported to the EPA, this is going to be a good segment of where we're going to go next. So now we're going to hone in a little further. So we got the macro view, we know the lingo, the terminology, how the regulations work. Top of the list for health-based violations with over 12 million people served are combined disinfectant and disinfectant byproducts. So let's go into disinfectants, since they're leading the list on the health-based violations. So there are two main disinfectants used, chlorine and chloramines. So the terms are used primary and secondary, but really both of them are being used. So chlorine, you can see the MRDL of 40 milligrams per liter. And I wanted to also point out the responsibility on notifications when they exceed those, when they exceed the maximum residual disinfectant levels, 30-day notice. What happens when they go above? Eye, nose irritation, stomach discomfort. There's also chlorine dioxide, which is less often used. They actually have to make it on site because it's explosive to transport. And that requires a 24-hour notice. When that goes above, you see anemia in infants and kids, as well as nervous system effects. Then there's chloramines. Who's been here? Has anybody heard about chloramines? So a few people, there's entire organizations, there's chloramine.org. This is receiving a lot more talk lately. So it's formed by adding ammonia to chlorine to the drinking water. And it takes longer to kill the buggers, so it's slower acting, so it doesn't kill them as fast, but it lasts longer in the water supply. And roughly 1 in 5 Americans are drinking water treated with chloramines. Above the MRDL is eye irritation, stomach discomfort, and anemia. All right. So we'll go to it on the next slide. So one of the reasons they're using the, I'll put this slide. So this is the disinfectant byproducts. So I also want you to think, when you think water supply, it's not stagnant. It's not there. Sometimes, depending on how large the population serving is, they change the water source. There's lots of things that impact water. It's not stagnant. They always do the same thing. It's a very dynamic process. And one of the things they're looking at, don't forget all those health-based violations we saw at the top of the list with the disinfection and the disinfectant byproducts, they're looking at, these are 2 major groups, the trihalomethanes and the haloacetic acids. And so what they're doing is they might be using chloramine instead of chlorine, because how disinfectant byproducts are formed is the organic matter in the water reacts with the chlorine or the chloramine, and you get these disinfection byproducts. So chloramine creates, to a lesser extent, these 2 specific disinfectant byproducts. So that's why some municipalities, they're able to stay within the regulations, because these 2, out of the minimum estimate is there's at least 600 disinfectant byproducts. These are the 2 groups that are getting more attention. We know more about them. And so what makes up the trihalomethanes? Chloroform, bromoform, bromodichloromethane, and dibromochloromethane. 90% of trihalomethanes is chloroform. All right, so what happens when there's long-term exposure above the maximum contaminant level? Liver, kidney, and central nervous system problems, reproductive health risks, preterm delivery, small for gestational age, increased risk of kidney and renal cancer, as well as increased risk of spontaneous abortion, miscarriages in the first trimester. What does that mean? I have 10 minutes left?
Because then I'm coming up.
I don't think we started on time.
No, we didn't.
Okay. I'm from New England and I can speed talk, but I think I just got up here. Oh, and the timer didn't start on the computer. Okay. So if you've seen Erin Brockovich in the last 2 years, everybody knows that Erin Brockovich, the hexavalent chromium. In the last 2 years, if you've seen her on video, she is screaming and shouting and trying to get the word out about the trihalomethanes. Because look at those numbers, and I included the citations there. For the miscarriages in first trimester, anywhere from 8 to 16% increased rates with trihalomethane exposure. That's incredible. The haloacetic acid, you can also see long-term increased risk of cancer. Unfortunately, Dr. Anne-Marie Fine sent me this study in July, very hot month in New Hampshire, and I stopped showering for a little while. So for trihalomethanes, temperature matters. I know, stay back. So for trihalomethanes, inhalation and dermal absorption during hot showers and baths increases your absorption rather than just drinking it. So this is one of the strong reasons of considering a point of entry filter into your home. Associated with bladder and colorectal cancer, highest levels in the blood after showering. Especially in New Hampshire, those cold winters, I love a hot shower, and I'm gonna open every window in the house and, you know, cold shower it. And so, all right. So, water fluoridation. I have to go really fast. I have a bunch of stuff left, but we'll get there. Grand Rapids, 1945, they talk about the rabbit hole. Well, this is a dinosaur hole, and I can't jump in it, right? This is a big hole. What I wanted to just let you know is a little bit about the status. As of 2012, 75% of the United States is drinking fluoridated water, and they have a goal. There's a goal set in our country by 2020 to have 80% of the population drinking fluoridated water. So you can see the light green has the highest levels of fluoridation. I'm proud that my state is darker in New Hampshire. Nevada is at 73.7%. It looks like you have a nice dark color here indicating a lower level. So fluoride, this is the maximum contaminant level. This is the, that's not the right expression for fluoridation, right? Some might say it's mass medication, but we're not going down that hole. So the EPA standards, they have a requirement to let you know when it's higher. The secondary standard of 2, they have to let you know within 12 months. So the Public Health Service recommends it as an effective recommendation, but the point I want to make is at the state and local level of who's fluoridating or not. So in New Hampshire, we have a bunch of grassroots to actually end fluoridation of certain municipalities. So they're taking it on community by community. And the big, the big argument, you know, you see, the popular argument you see out there is it's for dental caries. This is great because this is 4 decades of data on 12-year-olds from the World Health Organization. And it looks at fluoridated versus non-fluoridated countries. All of them had a decrease in dental caries in 12-year-olds in the last 40 years, regardless of fluoridation. Fluoridation does not mean lower dental caries. I don't know what Iceland, Italy, and New Zealand were doing in the 70s with 8 cavities per 12-year-old, but all of them went down. All right, so dental fluorosis in the United States. The reason why I wanted to point this one out is this is in 2004, we had up to 41% dental fluorosis in the United States. That's huge. And so that's hypomineralization. Imagine what it's doing to the bones, but so you can see. And actually in 1962, it was 0.7 to 1.2. And it was actually only in 2015 that they lowered it to 0.7. All right, this is a little side note. I think, how many of us are water pushers out there? We talk about hydration. Raise them high. We know you're doing it. All right. So this is a study to let you know how the average fluoride intake milligrams per day. And they consider high consumers at 2,000 milliliters. That's 67 ounces. So just the increased rates of different populations that are going to have even increased exposures. There's a little bit more on that. So health impacts. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, I'd say the number 1 is the neurotoxicity and the loss of IQ points for our children across the United States. The data is pretty clear that as fluoride goes up, children's intelligence goes down. And how they originally, they saw some of these trends is that in China, they have very high levels of naturally occurring fluoride in the water, and they saw the neurotoxicity and the effect on the kids. We also have that in the United States, naturally occurring fluoride in our groundwater sources. Unfortunately, I did have that link for you to check it out, but it disappeared. It was on the EPA site and it's gone now. I know. Boo. I wanted to point this out because I think all of us have patients with hypothyroidism. We've seen anemia and all the other things. But I did want to point out this was a study done in England where they looked at fluoridated areas versus non-fluoridated, twice the incidence of hypothyroidism in fluoridated areas. All right, this one is just another interesting one. As the fluoridation levels went up, so did the carotid arteriosclerosis. And there's some, some interesting tidbits in there on the intracellular cell adhesions. The next one I'm going to talk about are PFOAs, and I hope the speed's okay. I want to keep going and keep you in it. This is actually the reason why I said I have to go into, I want to know more about water. 2 years ago, a patient walked into my office and she had a letter from her municipality saying she had elevated levels of PFOAs in her drinking water and she had to start drinking bottled water. I said, what? So this began my first dive into water. So PFOAs, I think we know a bit about them. It's very stable in the environment. It's a fully fluorinated organic acid. And let's see, we see it in stain resistance, Teflon, Gore-Tex. We see it in firefighter foam, all over the places. In the NHANES data, thanks Dr. Cutler, we've seen for the last 1999 to 2012, 99% of Americans have PFOAs in their blood. All right, so we see water sources. You can see it from manufacturing sites, industrial sites, fire and crash training areas, industrial and municipal sites. Back in New Hampshire, we have an Air Force base, and we also had a company called Saint-Gobain. Saint-Gobain dumped in and around. It's a big government contract. There's a lot of government contracts, and of course the Pease Air Force Base with all the fire and crash training areas. All right, toxicokinetics, only because I'm not sure how much we know about these. We know a lot about the metals, and they've talked about this all day. I thought it was kind of interesting that PFOAs are absorbed in the GI tract, but they bind to albumin, our best taxis. They take up a bunch of seats, and they also knock our endogenous nutrients and hormones off of the sites, right? The things that we want. So they take our taxis, they bump others off, and they mess up the seats. They screw up the receptor sites on albumin. All right, so we always want to know where things are stored. For PFOAs, high concentrations in the liver. It's greater in males than in females. It's also in the kidneys, lungs, heart, and muscle, also the testes and uterus. And again, for just how it binds and interacts with receptors, the PPAR alpha, that's where we're going to see the cholesterol effects. It affects the metabolism of our macronutrients, but also T3 and transport proteins and enzymes. Health impacts. I'm going to skip to the next one. It's similar information, but this is conceptual model for PFOA in finished drinking water. This is on the EPA site. So this is a great slide, and it shows the impact: cardiovascular and serum lipid effects, liver effects, developmental, reproductive, immune, thyroid, and cancer. All right, a bunch of towns that have mass dumping. Harvard Gazette, this is from August of last year. Unsafe levels of toxic chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, the larger group, was found in drinking water in 33 states. The Harvard study also found that 6 million residents were drinking water above the 70 nanograms per liter. In addition, the actual number would likely be even higher for these data, because it's lacking data for almost a third of the population, so about 100 million people they didn't have data for. And this is also of where some of the worst offenders were, which states they were in. And then I also want to point out that the health guideline of 1 part per trillion instead of 70 is what the EWG is using, but that's also based on, there's a lot of studies out there of when the health impacts, the negative health effects start. And Philippe Grandjean of Harvard University, we've seen him on a bunch of stuff, has done a bunch of work on the PFOAs, and the 70 is way too high. All right, I want to point these out if anybody has any interest, because also I'm hoping that some of you will go to the second link. The first one is the PFAS project, is a brain trust of brilliant professors at Northeastern University doing this now. And they're also doing a site tracker. And I want to point out in Flint, Michigan, has 1,300 parts per trillion. Right now, we're all talking about the lead, but you can click on that second link, go to your state and see where the high levels are, and you can see what's happening. You can also see who did the dumping. The next one I want to point out is the C8 Science Panel. This is really unique in environmental medicine, the C8 Science Panel. In Parkersburg, West Virginia, DuPont had been dumping PFOAs since the 1950s in this town. Oh. And the reason why it's so fascinating is because they'd been dumping since the 1950s, a big lawsuit. The C8 Science Panel was formed, independent science panel, and what they did is they took samples from 70,000 residents. Imagine that. So the data we have on the health effects of PFOAs is very strong. So those are really great resources and sites if you want to look a little further or see if there's PFOAs or if any of your patients might have been affected by PFOAs. Arsenic. Number 1 exposure is water. I think hopefully everybody has heard that before. Drinking water is your number 1 source of exposure. Luckily, we have a panel behind us. A Q&A panel, okay. All right, so arsenic, these are the levels, parts per billion, the maximum contaminant level of 10. New Jersey set theirs lower, California even lower. Arsenic is still, as Lynn was talking about, is number 1 on the ATSDR. This, I think, is great because hopefully this sticks in your mind of arsenic. Arsenic is naturally found in bedrock, right? It's naturally occurring in our underground waters. You can see the toughest areas are the western coast, so that's at 50 and 10 nanograms per liter in New England. We've had some super fun sites in Dartmouth doing a lot of work on arsenic in our water supply in New Hampshire. So it's naturally much higher levels in certain regions of the country. Public wells, the USGS, which I noticed there's an office just 2 blocks away from here, United States Geological Survey, found that 10% of sampled wells, public wells, have over the 10 parts per billion. 43 million Americans, these are your patients, have private wells, and they are not, there's no mandates for testing. Arsenic above the 10 for over 500,000 people. And I think that's, of course, that's a very high level. Arsenic above the health guideline, and this is the 0.004, serving over 70 million people. We know the health impacts. I did want to point out for children it's an even greater concern, because don't forget there's also the grapes, the apples, the chicken, and the rice. So they're also getting from the water supply and the food supply. And it's a lot more per pound per body weight for kids. Mercury, I'm almost done. Mercury, the reason why I wanted to point this out, it's not because it's a problem in the drinking water supply. It's a problem in our lakes and streams. And 2/3 of mercury is from human-made sources, coal burning. So I want to point that out. Burning coal for energy production was the single largest component of mercury emissions in the United States, accounting for slightly more than 1/2 of the total. Especially when we're talking about energy sources, if you need a little factoid in your back pocket, we've already heard about coal burning, but this is a huge problem. And we have a bunch in New England to the south of us, right? In the southern states with their coal burning, and that gets carried up and dumped, the mercury gets dumped into New England, and our water streams and lakes are a mess. So this is newer data from the U.S. Geological Survey, and it showed that, let's see, methylmercury in fish exceeded the EPA guidelines for protection in about 1 in 4 streams in the United States. This is heartbreaking. I never thought about this as a kid when I went swimming or in any lakes, and I think about it all the time now. A little too much now. In 2008, 50 states and territories fish consumption advisories in every state. And then I was thinking, you know, because I always want to motivate change, right? Like, what if we could put all, you know, the big fisher organizations, those people who love fishing, have them go after the, you know, the coal burning industry. Let's make a marriage and a partnership there. So I thought that would be great. The health impacts. And then I'm going to turn it over, thanks for your attention, and to Dr. Anne-Marie Fine.
Okay, so we're going to start with hexavalent chromium, which is the Aaron Brockovich carcinogen. And so the movie Aaron Brockovich was all about hexavalent chromium. The largest lawsuit that ever paid out was as a result of this. It was $333 million paid by PG&E. This was such a huge deal, and it happened in Hinckley, California, that California became the only state that tests for hexavalent chromium in their water. So this is kind of an interesting story that's still developing. But anyway, it's a carcinogen. It's a group 1 carcinogen. It's a reproductive toxicant. You can get it through inhalation, ingestion, and contact with skin. So it's on the California Prop 65 list. So in Hinckley, I want to point out some of these numbers, and then we'll find out what they mean later. But the average chromium-6 was found to be 1.19 parts per billion, with the estimated peak of 20 parts per billion. So the average was only 1.19. This becomes relevant in a little bit. But in California in 2001, they had a health goal established of 0.02 parts per billion. And again, California is the only state that tests for it. And then in July of 2014, the California EPA became the first state to establish MCL, and they set it at 10 parts per billion due to the cancer risk. So 10. Which is not even, which is 10 times the average of Hinckley is the salient point there. So 38% of water in California has detectable levels of hexavalent chromium over 1 part per billion, which is about the average found in Hinckley. So here's a map, courtesy of EWG.org, of hotspots for hexavalent chromium. You can see that Oklahoma has the highest amount. And so there's a lot of, there's 89% cities in California tested higher than California's proposed original health goal was 0.06, and 89% of the cities tested were already higher than that. And so then when they changed it in 2011 to 0.02, that just means pretty much everybody was missing the mark on that California health goal. The health goals are not enforceable, but they are, you know, an aspiration, I guess. And so in California, the state legal limit is 10 parts per billion, which is 500 times the stated health goal. And the story hasn't ended yet, because this summer California was in court again, trying to overturn this 10 parts per billion legal limit. And they succeeded in overturning this. So this has gone away, because the whole legal reason that it was turned over, it failed because that original goal did not goal, the stated legal limit did not take into account the economic feasibility of reaching that. So basically, we're just telling the people of California, we can't afford to keep the hexavalent chromium out of your water. But if you sue us, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars that we can pay you. So it's kind of, it's eerie because California tests for it, but it's, you know, it's not that helpful. I'm thinking, I live in Newport Beach, California, and so recently I got my water report in the mail, and so I compared my hexavalent chromium with the health goals of California, and it was 700% higher, 700% higher. So anyway, it's detected in the drinking water supplies for more than 250 million Americans in all 50 states at levels exceeding the California state health goal. And so in the same way Flint, Michigan was the tip of the iceberg for lead, Hinckley, California was just the tip of the iceberg for the problem of hexavalent chromium in our water. So let's turn to lead, because lead is a problem in water as well. And the problem with lead is that for the most part, we have an aging infrastructure in the United States where lead pipes were used at the beginning of the century for the water supply. And so under certain conditions, the lead is leaching into the water supply. What happened in Flint, Michigan was they switched the water supplies, and my understanding is that the new water had chloramine in it, and the old water used chlorine, and the chloramine is very kind of abrasive to the pipes, and so the lead was able to be leached into the water. So lead, as we know, we've talked a lot about the problems in lead, so I'm not going to go through that too much. No safe level of lead. So in EWG.org, they put up very recently a water feature, and you can look up your own water by your zip code. And so but before that, they're showing that almost 19,000 public water systems had at least one detection level of lead above 3.8 parts per billion. And this is the level at which a formula-fed baby is at risk for elevated blood lead levels. That's how they determine that part. And so you can see on this map, this is the lead exposure map, and you can see that there's hot spots in the Midwest, a lot of hot spots in the Midwest, some in the West, and along the East Coast as well. So in the way they test lead and actually copper too is they test it at the tap. Instead of testing it at the water municipality, they test it at the tap, because the problem is not that it's in your water supply coming to you. The problem is the pipes bringing it to you, maybe bringing it to your faucet. So this is tested at your faucet. And the way it works is that under federal rules, the lead in water must be under 15 parts per billion in 90% of your samples, meaning in 10% of your samples, it could be higher, but as long as in 90% of your samples it's under 15, then you're okay. So the highest level detected in 2015 was 53.7 parts per billion. And the EPA's recent modeling suggests that lead concentrations in the 3.8 to 15 parts per billion range can put the formula-fed baby at risk. So in California, they instituted a public health goal, again, not enforceable, and the level is 0.2 parts per billion for the lead drinking water to protect against even subtle IQ loss in children. So these federal regulations are 75 times higher than the California health goal. So the health goals, I mean, they're the ones that are using the science to create the best possible scenario for the people using the waters, but they're not enforceable and they're not considered state and federal enforceable guidelines. So let's look at Portland's water, lead water. So Portland is the city that had the highest level of lead detected at 53.7 parts per billion, but you can see in that red sliver of the pie that they only had bad readings 9.3% of the time. So because it was under 10%, they were A-okay on the lead because it was under the 10%. So that's how that works. And then I just picked some other cities to take a look at. Issaquah, Washington looks pretty good at 6.2 parts per billion. Flint had 707 in 2015. Chicago was kind of on the high side too. Chicago does have an aging infrastructure problem too. They had 120. And then in Phoenix, it was 20.4 in 2015. So those are some regulated, there are regulated things in your water supply and there are unregulated things in your water supply. And of the 80,000 chemicals in our environment, even if only 3,000 of them are high use, they're not all regulated. When you get your water report, there's not a lot of data there. There's just about this much. So I want to have a slide talking about the emerging chemicals of concern that are completely unregulated in the water supply that people are not checking. And number one is pharmaceuticals, because the municipal supplies are not able to get those out. They're not designed for that. But the SSRIs are pretty high. We should all be feeling pretty good, you know, with that information. There's a lot of anti-anxiety medication in our water, so why are people so anxious? So when you get an anxious patient, you can say, don't you drink your tap water? And then the beta blockers, antibiotics, and hormones are all in our water supply. And then now we're getting nanomaterials like titanium dioxide from sunscreen in the water. That's not good. Pesticides and herbicides like Roundup and glyphosate are getting into the water as well. You can test this yourself. And I know people who have tested their water supply in Southern California for glyphosate and found it bumping right up against one of the limits that has been looked at as being safe or unsafe. Phthalates, BPA, artificial sweeteners have been found in water, and 1,4-dioxane, which I hope you remember from my lecture on personal care products. That silly byproduct is actually, there's enough of it that it's getting into the water supply, and so that's problematic as well. So how does water get into your home? I want to talk a little bit about this before we start talking about the filters. So we started out with the lead pipes, and then they got old and crumbly, and then copper pipes started coming out in the 1950s, and I found some really interesting literature on Alzheimer's disease incidence also rising after the copper pipes came out, and so animal studies are showing that tiny amounts of copper in water, 0.12 parts per million, enhanced an Alzheimer's type toxicity in rabbits and mice. And you have to say Alzheimer's type toxicity because, you know, you can't really talk to them. They don't talk back. And there was also a great study showing that the Japanese people in Japan didn't have a very high rate of Alzheimer's at all, strikingly low. But after they migrated to Hawaii, oh, and by the way, copper pipes are banned in Japan. That was a salient point. But after they migrated to Hawaii, and Hawaii had copper pipes, the rates of Alzheimer's disease in these Japanese people rose And that was in a study that hopefully is at the bottom. So for reference, the amount of copper allowed in human drinking water in the US by the EPA is 1.3 parts per million, which is 10 times the amount found to be toxic in the animal models. And the copper falls into that lead and copper rule where 10% of the samples can be as bad as it can be, but 90% of them have to be good. So you have to test your water, and the studies are suggesting that below 0.01 parts per million would be safe in terms of this Alzheimer's data. And in Newport Beach, the copper in my water, which is coming from your pipes, is 0.17, and it's 17 times higher than what is considered safe. So that's how water's getting into your home. So now the copper pipes, they don't last forever either. But here's the thing. They really corrode with the chloramine. And our water supply has switched over from chlorine. The trihalomethanes, the disinfection byproducts, were getting to be so high because our water is getting dirtier that in order to keep the disinfection byproducts low enough to keep into federal regulations, they had to go to something different. That's chloramine. And it corrodes the copper pipes. It causes something called pinhole leaks, which is a huge problem in Southern California and Texas, maybe all of California, but it's very intriguing. So let me wait. Okay, so it forms, the hard water will form like a polyp on the copper pipes, and then the chloramine is abrasive and will form a pinhole leak, and then these tiny leaks will drip silently because you didn't break the pipe. You didn't get a gusher. You didn't get obvious signs of water coming through your ceiling. It's just like a tiny drip behind your drywall, and it can cause mold and other issues. And so I just learned about this during the process of putting this talk together, and also talking to one of the water experts in my area who designs custom whole house water systems. And so he told me about this particular problem. And so my question to all of you is, could this be a contributor to the epidemic of mold contaminated homes? This problem of pinhole leaks, which I just found out about. And I've known about mold for a long time, but I had no idea. But I just wonder how much of it is just these pinhole leaks. So there's an example, a picture of it. It's just a tiny, you see that tiny drop of water. Sometimes there's a little spray, but it's not, you didn't break the pipe. There's not like a huge gusher of water. So we're just kind of making mold. Okay, so the current alternative that seems to be really popular is something called PEX piping. And I want to bring this to your attention because it's fairly newish. And it may not be something you want to bring into your home, or it should be something that you know about. It's basically plastic pipes. Do you want plastic, after all we talked about plastics today, do you want plastic pipe to bring the water to your faucet? It's so cheap compared to copper that a lot of the new homes are using it, and it's very prevalent in my area. So some of the problems with PEX piping is there's odors reported, and they're calling some of the contaminants odorants, which I think is interesting. Like, they have no other problems, people, they just smell a little bit bad. Your water is completely safe. This was actually said. So they're known to introduce carcinogenic chemicals like ETBE. New Hampshire is the only state there that has standards for that. And toluene, which is a solvent used in plastic resin synthesis. And one study looked at the odors, and basically what this study said was after 30 days, whatever problems are there with smelly bad water that smells like gasoline, it all clears up. And so the contaminants that they found that were causing the odors were toluene, ETBE, and some unidentified contaminants. And I thought, but in some homes, the problem is in some homes it doesn't go away, but in other homes it's like, who's drinking that water for 30 days? And here is a list of the impurities in PEX in the actual material. You can see that you would want to think twice about having some of these materials leach into your water. And then I found a study on PEX and the potential to form biofilm. You can see that the least biofilm forming substance on there is actually copper. The worst is actually stainless steel, which I don't understand. And then you can see that PEX is the second worst for the potential to form biofilms, which is not something that you want going on in your pipes. And then PEX has the odor issues. Oh, the ETBE and the MTBE. MTBE is like a blast from my past, because in my prior life, before becoming a naturopathic physician, I was a corporate controller for a petroleum company in Long Beach, California, home to giant, beautiful refineries. And in the wintertime, we had to add MTBE to our fuel, because it was felt at the time to decrease the air pollution, the particles in the air. And so since that time, MTBE has been found to be very toxic. And not only that, it's so water soluble. It's now in our water supply, in our ground and water surface, and it's so water soluble. It will lead the plume, followed closely by toluene. So really the reason why I'm here is probably karma, huh? But anyway, for us it was just revenue rev up. Woohoo, it's the winter time, we get to charge more for our gasoline, right? Okay. So here we go. The MTBE, it's a big problem. The cleanup for MTBE is so high that who will pay for it is entirely controversial. Anyway, let's talk about some filtration technologies. So the filtration technologies, there's just different levels of different substances, and you need to know what is in your water supply that you want to take out before you can make an educated decision on what you're going to do for your filtration technology. So there are filters that I'm just going to talk a lot about the components of filtration technology, and when you start shopping for one, then this will make sense to you, so you will know these terms. Ceramic is going to be really tiny holes that lets water through but blocks solid contaminants like cysts and sediments, does not remove chemical contaminants from your water. Deionization is ion exchange that removes the mineral salts and other electrically charged molecules from your water, but doesn't remove microorganisms or non-ionic contaminants, including trihalomethanes and other common VOCs. So you're getting the idea that you would never want to use either one of these really alone. Distillation, it heats your water enough to vaporize it, removes many things, but it doesn't remove chlorine, trihalomethanes, or other VOCs from the water. So that's good to know too. And by the way, chlorine is fairly easy to remove. So that's not going to be your biggest problem when you're looking for a filter. Ion exchange passes your water over a resin that replaces undesirable ions with others that are more desirable, like water softening. Ozone kills bacteria and other microorganisms, does not remove chemical contaminants. So this is something that would be a great add-on, but you're not going to use this alone. Reverse osmosis, pushing your tap water through a semi-permeable membrane that blocks particles larger than the water molecules. Now this is effective at removing arsenic, fluoride, hexavalent chromium, nitrates, perchlorate, does not remove chlorine, chloramine, radioactive gases, trihalomethanes, or other VOCs. So many RO systems include other components that further filter the water. So the RO system on its own is not the perfect filter that many people believe that it is. And also the quality of both the membrane system and the carbon filter that has to go along with it can vary greatly, so you want to make sure that you look at that. And also, please tell your patients if they're going for any water filtration technology, including reverse osmosis, it requires some maintenance, or you're not doing yourself any favors, and it's losing the ability to filter because you're exhausting, in many cases, your media. So the RO wastes water as well. So carbon filtration, we've got coal, and that's cheap, and it's got large pores. You've got wood-based carbon, and better, you've got coconut shell-based carbon, which is going to be cleaner and better for a wide variety of chemicals. But if you combine them all together, you get a wider range. But here's some more carbon structures: carbon block, granulated microns. The bottom one, the catalytic carbon, this is the Cadillac. That's why it begins with cata. Catalytic carbon, Cadillac. So you need a catalytic carbon in your filter if you ever hope to remove any chloramine. Chloramine is very difficult to remove. And according to our water experts, there's a lot of filters out there, and the term they use is it will knock down chloramine. And I said, what is that? I finally said, what does that mean, it knocks it down? I mean, you don't talk like that with other contaminants. And a lot of the water filters are able to knock down chloramine only by 70%. I mean, 70% is, considered good. And so it's not even able to get it all away. Now that's, there are some filters out there that their claim to fame is chloramine removal, and they'll get out 99%, but then, you're gonna pay a lot more. So chloramine, keep in mind that that's something you very much want to ask about for your filters. If you have chloramine in your water supply, and that's something you can determine by calling your water supply company and figuring it out, or looking at your water report. So water quality status, there are some resources for you, and you can look at the EWG water base, and you want to test your water and figure out what's in there. You need a TDS meter, especially if you have an RO. You need to test your dissolved solids once a month if you have an RO. You really have to keep up on that. And then we have the whole house water filtration, where your contact time with the media is the key point. Used to be that 1.5 cubic feet of plain old coconut charcoal was enough. But now with the addition of chloramine about 10 or 15 years ago, it's not enough. You need 2 cubic feet for the average home, and you need catalytic carbon to knock down the chloramine, and even so might only get 70% of it. So it's really the custom whole house units that really go after the chloramine that will get more. You need to make sure that the carbon doesn't channel. Water finds the path of least resistance, and so it will make a channel through your media, and then you won't be able to have as effective a filter. And so if you do if your system has backwashing, and the backwashing has the ability to rebed your media, you have exposure of fresh surface area. Otherwise, you are exhausting your media and you're making little channels through it. And then you must have a sediment filter if there's no backwashing. And so there are actually, on the market, there are back flushing and not back washing, well, flushing, I guess I'm using them interchangeably. But there's actually, in whole house water system, there's 2 different kinds, flushing or non-flushing. And so these are the kinds of things, if you have a backwashing unit, there'll be a valve on your unit in the garage, and it will go every 7 to 10 days, and it will automatically do a backwash through your system, and then it will rebed the media, and then you're good to go again. But there are off-the-shelf units who do this a little bit differently. And then you can get environmentally sound salt-free water systems where when you backwash that water, you're wasting that water, except for the fact that it can be directed into your water irrigation system, turns into gray water, and works really well. So the seals and standards, I'll just leave that for you guys. But you want to have vetting questions. You want to ask questions when you're looking at your filter. You can't randomly pick one or ask your friends what they got. They may not live where you live and have the same challenges that you have. So the chloramine, the radionuclides, and the fluoride are very challenging to filter. They are the first contaminants to exhaust the media. You must have a catalytic grade carbon if you want to get your chloramine levels down. Chlorine, by way of contrast, is one of the easiest to remove. So if you have a filter that says we get out 100% of chlorine, that's actually not saying that much. So a question to pose is how many gallons and to what percentage can they remove chloramine and fluoride? Fluoride's very difficult to get out. And then you can use orders of priority for your water filter, because it's felt, according to all the experts I've ever talked to, any filter is better than no filter, otherwise you become the filter. And so you can get a 0.5 micron catalytic carbon-based carbon block filter. You can get an RO system. But you've got to have additional components that do the rest of the deal. So they range in price, but it just kind of depends on your budget. But I will say that there is one that begins with a B that I maybe wouldn't recommend, because it just sits in a plastic pitcher, and that's not good. Shower filters. They're not very expensive. Boy, did I get a shock when I discovered that even though chlorine's not that difficult to remove, shower filters actually don't remove very much chlorine, but it has to do with flow, because you have to have contact time with the media. And so if you want to get more chlorine out of your shower filter, don't blast it. You have to go slower on the flow. And so that's one way to get a little bit more chlorine out. But I was kind of shocked that it didn't get more out. And then the whole house is the best option for decreasing total exposure. But you still need to do point of use. You still need to do point of use. But the whole house is good because you're not vaporizing the chloroform in the shower. And that's why you feel so good when you take a hot shower, because you're getting anesthetized. Okay. So I talk a little bit more about non-flushing or a static whole house filter will be cheaper than the backwashing kind, but it may not do as good a job, and it won't do as much with chloramine, and there will be possibly more cost to maintain. And the top of the line would be a custom whole house filter that focuses on your water supply in your community with the contaminants that you face, and taking into account how many bathrooms and people and how big your house is. And it would ideally be a backwashing 2.0 cubic feet with catalytic media and a sediment filter. And so then you still have to use point of use for drinking and cooking if you're going to do the whole house filtration. So here are some websites or links to look at for action on taking care of your water supply. Thank you so much for your time and attention.